what the Raj actually was 100 years ago, and the fact that it stretched all the way as far as Aden in what's now southern Yemen. And Yemen certainly never features in our history textbooks. I think that the relationship between Edwina and Nehru, much has been written on it, and there's all sorts of theories. Maybe they had a relationship, is that they were close enough to make Jinnah at the time so suspicious that he refused to let Mountbatten stay on as Governor General of Pakistan after independence.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Booked. I'm Gaurav Sawant. 100 years ago, from the Red Sea to the jungles of Burma, now Myanmar, through Yemen, through Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and across undivided India, through Burma, people used the Indian rupee to trade, and of course the passports were stamped the Indian Empire. 50 years ago, that empire began to come apart at the seams. 5 partitions tore the empire apart. Shattered land exposed those 5 partitions from 1930s to 1971 that actually gave birth to 12 nations, from Yemen to UAE to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Shattered land, 5 partitions in the making of a modern South Asia by Sam Dalrymple, has spellbinding stories of how the British Raj, where once upon a time they said that the sun never sets in the Raj, the same British couldn't wait to leave India as fast as possible. And even after they left, their legacy includes several festering wounds. Sam Dalrymple is a Delhi-based Scottish historian and an award-winning filmmaker. He graduated from the Oxford University, Persian and Sanskrit language scholar. He's also studied at the University of Isfahan. He's worked across South and Central Asia, and he joins me on this special broadcast. Sam, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Sam, fascinating account of the Raj, and especially the Raj coming apart brick by brick. India, as you mentioned, was the jewel in the crown, and the Raj that stretched from the Red Sea to the Bay of Bengal and beyond to Burma. I want to understand from you what brought about this book. What were your thoughts that you thought of piecing together? Because we know of India, Pakistan, and then India, Bangladesh, but not all the way from the Red Sea to the Bay of Bengal and beyond.
So the book began when I was speaking to a man from Tripura, and I was asking about partition. I was working on partition testimonies at the time for the 75th anniversary in 2022. And when I said when I asked about partition and how it affected his hometown, he said, "Which partition? Was I talking about the separation from Burma in 37? Was I talking about the Great Partition of 47? Or was I talking about 71? And
71.
Bangladesh's partition from Bangladesh's partition from
Yeah.
Pakistan. And that got me thinking, because Burma very rarely features in our image of South Asia and the Raj. And then I began to look at what the Raj actually was 100 years ago, and the fact that it stretched all the way as far as Aden in what's now southern Yemen. And Yemen certainly never features in our history textbooks that I read growing up in Delhi. And yet, everyone from Dhirubhai Ambani was living there back in the 1950s. And it was once an integral part of India, so much so that a Yemeni Jewish woman trying to migrate to Jerusalem after the Balfour Declaration declares Palestine a homeland for the Jews, she has to migrate on an Indian passport because by virtue of living in Yemen, she is Indian. And this is a story that we've entirely forgotten. The scale of the Raj is something that we've forgotten. And the fact that Dubai could have almost become part of modern India is a story that we've entirely forgotten.
True. And the partition of India and the carving of a Muslim majority Pakistan. Now, that's been a subject that's been written about pretty extensively. However, your book traces the inspiration for Pakistan to events a decade earlier in Burma.
Yes. So Burma was the first partition. Burma was India's richest province for over 100 years. And it was the wealthiest province, and yet immigration from the rest of the Raj led to increasingly Burmese people being pushed out of jobs, being pushed out of their homes because they couldn't afford rent. And the newspapers from 1920s and 30s Burma feel oddly reminiscent of British debates about Brexit. Should we remain as part of this union and should we not? And eventually, on April Fool's Day 1937, they separate. And this is the first time that a province has persuaded the government that it has its own separate identity and should thus be separated and made into a separate British colony. And within a few weeks of that happening, you get the first use of the term Pakistan by Rematali Chaudhry, who comes up with the name, and he explicitly justifies the creation of Pakistan on the basis that if Burma was allowed to separate, why can't we?
Yes, yes. And India, as we continue to grapple with the problems that emerged then and today, the problem of Pakistan state-sponsored terror, as we did with raiders in 1947, why did the liberation of Goa spook Pakistan, spook Field Marshal Ayub Khan?
So this is one of the things that I found fascinating, is that throughout the 1950s, after the first war over Kashmir, India and Pakistan actually get on quite well. They manage to put the past behind them. And to an extent that we've completely forgotten, they share intelligence. India and Pakistan are sharing intelligence to stop communist revolutions during the Cold War. They're signing treaties. And the turning point actually seems to be around the time of India's liberation of Goa. Ayub Khan becomes convinced that India is got a new expansionist mindset and that it's now taking bits that it historically considers part of India, and that if Goa is first, Pakistan will be next. And it's in the wake of that that you've got the first Pakistani sponsorship since 1947. You've got the first Pakistani sponsorship of militias in India. Specifically, he begins funding the Nagas and the Mizos in northeast India. And within 2 months of that, RAW in India finds out and begins sponsoring Pashtun and Bengali separatists in Pakistan. And the proxy war that is continuing to this day actually begins then. And I think we didn't truly realize this until recently. A series of former intelligence files were declassified. And there's a brilliant scholar called Avinash Paliwal who got to look at these in the National Archives in Delhi. And, the whole story was laid out, and it was a kind of Cold War thriller that no one's ever been able to look at before.
And did Pakistan also have these archives? Did Pakistan chronicle it? They were very desperate. If we were to talk about what was happening in then East Pakistan, of course, we'll come to that subsequently. Did they burn all those documents? Or is Pakistan funding, or then East Pakistan funding of fueling the insurgency in India's northeast, is that well documented even in Pakistan?
So it is. In 1971, during the war for Bangladeshi liberation, almost all of the documents kept in Dhaka were burnt. But however, most of the documents that are sitting in Lahore, Islamabad, and Karachi are still there and are still accessible to scholars. There's a brilliant scholar, for example, called Yaqub Bangash, who has done amazing work using the archives there. But it's much harder for non-Pakistanis to access those archives. So scholars like me, whilst I was able to access all the archives in India and several of the other countries in the book, for example, Qatar, I was able to get into some personal archives in Pakistan. I was not able to get into a lot of the state archives and look at declassified intelligence, etc. there, because they have very, very strict rules on what you can access as a scholar.
In this conversation, let's go back and forth a little. I did, jump to the liberation of Goa and Pakistan fueling insurgency in the northeast. I want to come back to just before independence. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India. You've written, and of course it's been chronicled, he was reluctant to come to India, and you've written that he feared that they'd return to Britain with bullets in their back. Explain this, sir.
So by 1946, when he's kind of first approached to become the last viceroy, the Quit India movement has just happened. One of the largest movements against British imperialism in Indian history. And I think at the time, many Brits assumed that it was going to be, like 1857 all over again, that you were going to get Indians start kind of attacking Brits in their beds and all this kind of thing. Of course, that's not what happens. And thanks to Mountbatten's rushed through partition, Indians actually turn on Indians, and you get some of the worst pogroms
Oh,
in
yes.
in world history. In the 12 million people forced to migrate from their homes, the largest forced migration of human history, and between 1 and 2 million people die in the partition pogroms, and yet virtually not a single Brit is killed in these pogroms. But when he goes out, it's not yet clear that that's the case, and there's still a lot more antipathy towards Brits than there are between Hindus and Muslims when he first is approached to go out.
You've mentioned at length what was the thinking of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. I want to for a moment talk about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. And the Iron Man of India did not think very highly of Lord Mountbatten. You've written that he thought of Lord Mountbatten more as a toy for Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to play with, but it was actually Lady Mountbatten, and that's again something that you've written about in different places, in bits and pieces, about her relationship with Pandit Nehru that made headlines not just then, it made headlines even then, but continued to make headlines over decades, and perhaps made Jinnah that time very suspicious of Lord Mountbatten's actions.
Precisely. I think that the relationship between Edwina and Nehru, much has been written on it, and there's all sorts of theories. Maybe they had a relationship. It's unclear precisely what happened. But what we do know for certain is that they were close enough to make Jinnah at the time so suspicious that he refused to let Mountbatten stay on as Governor General of Pakistan after independence. So after independence, Mountbatten stays on in India as Governor General for a few more months, but he does not stay on in Pakistan. And so when that first war in Kashmir breaks out, there is no joint Governor General to oversee the whole thing. And that is partly a result of Jinnah's suspicions about Nehru and Edwina's relationship. What happened between them, we don't know, because no one ever wrote it down. There are still, files that are closed to us. In Southampton University has all of their private letters, but they're not open to the public still.
Some letters you've mentioned, the way they'd sign off those letters, and what they'd write in some of those letters you've mentioned in the book, and what was the appreciation of those, including in the Muslim League that time, about their relationship or friendship. You've written words to the effect that even that time, people were talking about this relationship within 10 days of Edwina Mountbatten and Lord Mountbatten being in India.
Yeah, and I think that it within just a few days, there's all sorts of people from, the head of the army's ADC, for example, writing in his diary that their relationship is raising eyebrows. Now, a lot of the writing that is subsequently written about their relationship does come from major political figures within Pakistan, and so it's unclear how much we can trust those sources, given that they have a bias towards presenting Nehru in a different way. But what is the case, without a doubt, is that they were very, very close, and so close that Jinnah was convinced that he could not trust the Mountbattens anymore.
And Lord Mountbatten was also, if I may, apprehensive about Sardar Patel. At one place you've mentioned, and I don't want to give out a lot because people would be very interested in reading this, when Sardar Patel suggested using the army to deal with the Muslim League, or as you say, to get rid of the Muslim League. Sardar Patel even replaced the head of India's intelligence bureau, and no longer a British man whose loyalties he suspected. So what was happening between Lord Mountbatten and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel?
So this is one of the most extraordinary bits of the independence saga that I think no one really knows. And it only came out about 10 years ago because it was kept hushed by both governments, India and Britain. But from about August 1946, Patel, as the Home Minister of the you know, government of India to be, had complete control over the intelligence services. And when Mountbatten arrives as viceroy, Patel has so much power that he is able to control which intelligence from the intelligence bureau Mountbatten is able to read. And so Mountbatten is constantly suspicious that he's not being told the full story and that Patel knows things that he's not telling him. And there's far more power, I think, in the hands of Sardar Patel than we tend to assume. And I think that new research is constantly coming out about how much of an important behind the scenes role that Patel played throughout the final months of British rule, because he had quite a lot of power.
Yes, yes. It's a fascinating story that I've heard from Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw about sending in the army, the signing of instrument of accession, his telling Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Jawahar, you want Kashmir or not? And the moment Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru says, of course I want Kashmir, he turns around and tells Sam Manekshaw, there you've got your orders, no, now go to Kashmir. That led to another controversy, didn't it, that you mentioned in your book?
So there is a controversy that has long reigned over whether Indian troops arrived in Kashmir before or after the signing of Kashmir's accession to India. So when the Maharaja of Kashmir signs the accession and it's delivered to Nehru, did the first Indian troops land in Srinagar before or after the fact? And Pakistan obviously uses this to, back up its claims to Kashmir and says that India sending in troops was illegal. I don't think you can go quite that far because, of course, the accession was signed by the Maharaja, no matter what you say, and it was on its way. But there remains all sorts of bits of the whole saga that remain unclear in terms of timelines. There's a lot of scholars who've gone into precisely the order of events, but I think
But by then, the Pakistanis, their raiders and army had already invaded Kashmir several days before. 22nd is the official day. But even before that, and this is something which is equally fascinating, Sam, where you've mentioned that the Pakistanis wanted to create unrest and send in the army within weeks of independence in September itself. And the person they tied up with actually wanted to get married and went on a honeymoon, and that is why the Pakistanis could not invade Kashmir in time, isn't it? Jammu and Kashmir in Poonch. Extraordinary.
It's extraordinary just how early they're doing it. But the crucial thing, I think, is the fact that this is all happening behind the back of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. This is the first time that members of the Pakistani army are going behind the back of their civilian government and beginning to fund proxy agents to enter Kashmir on their behalf. It's a process that we've seen so many times since 1947. Members of the army going beyond their jurisdiction in Pakistan, and this is the very first time that it happens. Jinnah, I think, for the first almost 3 months, has no idea what's happening. It's only 3 months in that he finally learns what members of his army have been doing.
Well, members of the British Indian Army were already playing games in Gilgit. You've written about how a certain British Army major got drunk, a couple of bottles of gin, and they planned, they arrested the Maharaja's army officer there, Colonel Ghansara Singh, if I remember the name correctly, was taken into custody, and they unfurled the Pakistani flag there. It just goes on to show that officers of the British Indian Army were also involved in helping Pakistan, or at least that is the belief. But I also want to ask you another question. Muhammad Ali Jinnah kept complaining that he got a moth-eaten Pakistan. But his own daughter, Dina, refused to migrate to Pakistan. Why was that?
So Dina, like Jinnah himself had married a Parsi, and
Yes.
she had settled down in Bombay. She'd married into the Wadia family that continues to be one of the richest families in Bombay today. And she didn't want to move to this new strange land. I think at the time of partition, no one knew how lasting and you know this border would be. Jinnah himself kept his house in Bombay because he thought he'd be able to cross over back and forth. Nehru, in the early days after partition, was writing about looking forward to visiting the northwest frontier again very soon.
Yes.
Once things calmed down, and so I think quite a lot of people assumed that the border would not become as hard and as impassable as it would later become.
And of course, then there's also the aspect about, okay, I'm going to come back to a lot of those points later. There's so much about the 1971 war, the last partition that you write about, and how India helped Mukti Bahini in those areas. You've written about how and I want you to just shed light on this. Pakistan didn't want to surrender. They were seeking a ceasefire, but it was General Jacob who almost went and put enough pressure before the US 7th Fleet could come into the Indian Ocean or the Bay of Bengal to force General A.A.K. Niazi to sign the instrument of surrender.
It's one of the great, most extraordinary stories in South Asian history, and one that still isn't fully understood. I mean, it's the South Asian equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In December 1971, the US, on the side of Pakistan, sends in its nuclear fleet into the Bay of Bengal to pressure India into surrendering. In response, the USSR, that has been getting closer to Mrs. Gandhi and to India, sends in its nuclear submarines into the Bay of Bengal. And there is a moment of Cold War nuclear brinkmanship. And it's at this point that General Jacob flies in to try and press Niazi for a full surrender. And there's a wonderful photograph that survives. I
Yes.
think the correspondent for the Observer newspaper gets stuck in the room with them and ends up eating a chicken lunch with them
Yes.
together whilst they're
Lemon chicken
discussing
and
the terms of the
bananas, if I
surrender.
remember correctly, or chicken legs and bananas. It's a
Exactly.
fascinating book. There's a lot about Hyderabad that I want to talk to you about, but perhaps we'll have to leave that for another day. Sam Dalrymple, lovely talking to you, and I hope we carry on this conversation even further in the days and weeks ahead, and wish you all the best with your book.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.